Elizabeth O'Brien from the Lead Group, and I founded the Lead Group in 1991 because of environmental health concerns. We understand from the New South Wales Environment Department that there are over 3.7 million homes in Australia that have lead paint at the pre-1970 level, which was unlimited. In other words, more than 1%. It was limited to 1% in 1970. Children are exposed to lead, especially lead from paint, which can be very high dose lead exposure. The worst impact is IQ loss and changes to learning behaviour. So the problem is that often a child is exposed to lead paint dust and soil on the garden, and the parents don't even know that there was lead paint sanded into that soil or into that dust, especially in carpet inside the house. So a child will play outside, play inside on the floor, and put their fingers in their mouth, as children do when they're little, and end up years later at school with a learning behaviour problem, which nobody ever then puts back to the fact that they were lead exposed as a young child. So that's the reason that lead poisoning is actually called the silent epidemic. So many children are poisoned without ever being tested, and you need a blood lead test to demonstrate that a child has been exposed to excessive levels of lead. Practically every month, or every year at least, there's a new finding on the health impacts of lead. So one, for instance, recently was that 2 out of every cases of cataracts is probably caused by lead in older males. So what you do today and in your early career as a painter, for instance, can come back to get you as you develop cataracts in old age.
My name is Professor Mark Taylor. I'm a Professor of Environmental Science at Macquarie University, and I've been working here in Australia for about 13 years now. I've got an interest in environmental lead and contaminants other than lead, arsenic, zinc, cadmium, copper, but in particular I focused on the effects of lead and the re-release of lead from either leaded paint, leaded gasoline, or from mining emissions in and around Australian environments. And in particular I'm interested in what effect those releases may have in terms of exposures to children and also to adults, but primarily children. We all know that lead paint was used ubiquitously in early houses in the turn of the 19th, turn of the 20th century and before. In terms of what do we know the risks associated with lead paint are, well, we know that if somebody sands a house which has got lead paint, they sand the woodwork and they generate a whole, they put millions and millions of particles of leaded paint. We know that the likelihood is that any children in that house or who come to that house will be exposed, as well as people who live adjacent to the house, because you can't keep the dust particles in one particular place. There's a legacy problem from the use of lead in paint that we don't fully understand the distribution of. But the risk remains, and that risk becomes a hazard once somebody decides to sand it or peel it, for example, and that generates all the little particulates. I've heard stories, I've had people ring me up with the children being lead poisoned from eating the paint chips, and they're living out, you know, in the more, what we'd consider newer parts of Sydney, like Balcombe Hills, for example. And I don't know how old their houses were, but the children been eating the paint and they got lead poisoned. So this risk, it's not gone away. It's been covered up in certain places with lead paint, and some of the problems that I've come across before, people are not aware of the problem. It becomes a problem when you remove it and you don't remove it properly and you don't take all the necessary safeguards. So, you know, if you're really concerned about it, I think it's probably when you're going to strip it right back, get a lead abatement paint specialist in to do that work for you. The risk of lead is greatest with young children, particularly under the age of 5, because their brains are developing, and as part of the development of a body and also in utero, the body's taking up calcium, lots and lots of calcium, to develop the neurons, to develop the signals to send the messages down the neurons, to develop the teeth, the bones, etc. But the problem is that, you know, lead and calcium look very similar to the body. They're both divalent ions, so calcium 2 plus, lead 2 plus. They look the same. So when a child is in a leaded environment, the mimicry of lead with respect to calcium means the body can't distinguish between the two, so it will take it up and it'll compete for space in the body's infrastructure. And as a consequence of that, when the lead replaces the calcium or some of the calcium, what happens then is that it doesn't function in the same way as calcium would do, so it doesn't allow the same mediating processes in the brain. The neuron switches don't work quite as well. It can also get problems associated with ADHD, other types of behavioural problems, delinquency, motor skills. A tiny amount before has now been erased. There is no safe amount. And I suppose that's one of the reasons why having proper lead abatement, properly trained painters and decorators, that they understand the risks, not only to themselves, but the risk that they may take home to their own families, but also to the clients that they're working for, that they're aware of all of those risks and they take preventative action. Because the damage might not be immediately apparent, and indeed somebody might not recognise the damage. If they don't get their child tested, they might just sort of see these unusual behaviours coming out in the children that they hadn't noticed before, and as a consequence of being accidentally exposed. I mean, to be frank, nobody really deliberately exposes their children to lead. It's all preventable, and it's a terrible tragedy, you know, when you get that insult to the brain, causes damage which is permanent. In the review, the National Toxicology Programme review of the harmful effects of low levels of lead exposure, they made the comment that there's something like 22,500 research studies that they considered and then selected from as part of their review. It's well established, that's the point I'm trying to make. The impact of lead is extremely clearly established, and we now know enough, so all we have to do is carry out the proper procedures and practices at a workplace, and these issues won't arise.